Grant recipients are required to maintain adequate documentation to support their accounting and cost records. The documentation should provide the means to verify proper segregation of spending between various federal awards and non-federal expenditures. The extent of the documentation required is affected by the size and complexity of the organization and the existing control mechanisms. The type of the documentation needed may also vary depending on the relationship between the activities and specific internal controls. Let's look at 4 areas of documentation with some examples of adequate source documentation in those areas. We'll start with authorization. Purchases should be properly authorized in accordance with internal policies and procurement standards. An example of adequate source documentation might include a purchase request or requisition that is signed by the manager with direct budgetary responsibility for the project or program being charged for the purchase. Without prior authorization documented in the purchasing records, you may not be able to demonstrate the purchase was properly authorized before the purchase was made. Therefore, purchasing documentation without evidence of proper authorization may be considered insufficient source documentation and risk the purchase being disallowed for charging the federal award. Time tracking is another area of documentation that gets a lot of federal scrutiny. An example of adequate source documentation for timekeeping would include time cards or other labor reporting completed in a timely manner. A time card should have sufficient detail to determine what award was worked on, when the work was done, who worked on the award, and when the time was reported. Now let's look at some examples of adequate source documentation for spending so you know what is required. First of all, adequate source documentation for spending includes having receipts with sufficient detail to be able to determine what the funds were spent on, when did the spending occur, and who made the purchase. Receipts that don't provide enough detail to determine what was purchased would not be considered adequate source documentation. An example of this would be a credit card receipt listing the total amount of the purchase, but not what was purchased. This is because a credit card receipt that only lists the total amount does not allow the grant recipient to ensure that the purchases were allowable for charging to a federal award. When it comes to adequate source documentation for reporting, this generally includes review of the related documentation and approval by an appropriate manager. An example could be reports that are supported by financial records and reviewed and signed by a suitable level of management. Reporting is not limited to just financial records. Adequate program documentation could include having a detailed narrative explaining the objectives of the project or program and how program activities are supporting those objectives. As you can see, there are many ways to ensure that federal funds are spent as required by the award and other regulations. To summarize, adequate source documentation includes the following elements: who spent the funds and who authorized the spending? What were the funds spent on? Where, that is, what award should be charged for the spending? And when was the spending authorized and when was it spent?